This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm your host, Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest this week is none other than Phineas Harper. The team at Centro, myself included, is in the built environment sector because we're dedicated to the outcomes we achieve, which is to say we're invested in the nature of the work. And that's why I had such a good time speaking with Phineas, who has a unique position in the sector as an activist, an organizer, and, dare I say, a provocateur. Please give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend us to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels MP, MS Podcast on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with Phineas Harper. Phineas Harper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
We always like to start off with a little bit about who you are and how you came to your role.
I'm an architecture critic and curator and sometimes sculptor. I studied architecture back in the day and then have been running away ever since, trying to get closer to the general public and to connect ordinary people with this epic, massive, interesting, important topic of city making.
Absolutely. And you've written for The Guardian. We've read some of the columns that you've had published there. And your CV is really quite intense.
Yeah. I was chief executive of Open City for 4 years, deputy director of the Architecture Foundation, but I'm also an opinion writer at various outlets. I've written for the FT, The Standard, The Guardian most commonly, also Dezeen. So
never heard of her. No, just kidding. And you have, I think, fair to say, a political sort of approach that's somewhere between left and centre left.
I'd say hard left. But
hard left.
I mean, increasingly, I'm interested in the intersection of politics and design.
Yes.
And that's what I end up writing about most, whether it's traffic planning or wildlife or the role of the police in urban design. It's that sort of prickly intersection where design issues come up against social issues.
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm most interested in, certainly in my critical writing.
And it couldn't be more relevant, really, in planning, especially because we're in a position at the moment with planning and construction and design and social consciousness about the built environment that a small c conservative approach seems like probably the least appealing offer. So, for example, we're not calling the podcast Planning Makes Sense. You know what I mean? I think there are a lot of really sincere and passionate voices who are looking at the built environment sector and the built environment and thinking, I don't think this is quite right. But you mentioned secure by design.
Yeah.
We call it secure by design as the sort of industry standard phrase. It's also known as designing out crime. It's known as hostile architecture. Can you tell me a little bit about your views and concerns? Yeah,
I mean, you're right that it's an interesting time to be thinking about the politics of design. We have a government that isn't really doing a huge amount, but one of the things they are doing is committing to building a whole load of new towns, 12 new towns, hundreds of thousands of new homes.
Yeah.
Whether they achieve it, we will see, but that is the one and only big policy is to build these new towns.
Yeah.
And so suddenly we have to have a national public conversation about, okay, what is a good place to live, what makes a good neighbourhood, what makes a good town centre. And I think something that makes the UK rather different to a lot of other countries, certainly in Europe, is the role that the police play in urban design. Hasn't always been this way. You know, back in the mid-20th century or even before that, the police were hardly involved at all in architecture and urban design. But since 1989, cops in Britain have developed this program called Secured by Design, which is essentially a way for them to influence design decisions about schools, new housing, public spaces, and not even just new public spaces or housing, but existing places. And so increasingly you have something called a designing out crime officer, who is someone who will insert themselves into the planning process and suggest a whole bunch of changes to a new housing scheme or something like that. And frequently these changes are not that good, or not that good for the communities that those housing projects will go on to serve. It's not just me who thinks this, many architects, even security consultants feel very frustrated by the Secured by Design program, which is extremely dogmatic, quite narrow-minded, seems to prioritize the wrong things from a community point of view, and often leads to housing schemes that are quite isolating, quite cut off from their surrounding neighbourhoods, quite difficult for residents to meet and get to know each other. So, yeah, Secured by Design is, I think, a sort of big problem, actually. If we are going to build 12 new towns, maybe we need to have a critical conversation about to what extent we should be involving the police in the design of those places, if at all.
To approach the same sort of position from a sort of a different terminology, you might say, to what extent are we prioritizing public spaces as public spaces of a civil society? And to what extent are we scenario dreaming about the drug stash and the everything else, right?
Yeah, there was a case fairly recently in South London where a small park where some local residents had got a grant from the local authority to plant climbing wisteria, big climbing flowers, gorgeous plants, and had been cultivating this park and making it look prettier and more inviting. The police had come along and cut all those plants down because they claimed that drug dealers could use these flowers to hide stashes of drugs, which is such a far-fetched scenario. But the result of that far-fetched scenario was the very real world and very immediate effect of ruining this park, getting rid of all of this publicly funded work that local people had put into it to make it nice and inviting. So I think secured by design is harmful in a number of ways, but one of the most obvious ways is how it almost incentivizes local authorities to make public spaces as uninviting as possible in order to disincentivize local people from actually using parks or streets or benches.
Anybody who's ever had food waste to throw away in a train station will also understand this. And I don't mean to sound too glib, but I have quipped to my friends before, if somebody wants to blow up a train station they're going to, like, why can't I just throw away my wrapper? You know?
No, it's absolutely true. And like the whole premise of the police's idea is that if you, like, for example, there's guidance in Secured by Design suggesting that instead of having benches, you should have individual seats set several meters apart. That's a direct quote from the Secured by Design guidance. And why do they do that? Because they want to deter loitering.
Yes.
Well, another word for loitering is socializing.
Congregating.
Hanging out with your friends on a bench is somehow deemed as antisocial behavior, even though it is the very definition of social behavior.
Yeah.
And so that we're really risking criminalizing activities that really are the basis of a good neighborhood or the basis of civic life, going out into the public space and interacting with friends and neighbors. Something needs to be done about this.
This is slightly off topic, but one nice thing I will say about the docos is that they're the only consultees that will speak to you beforehand and that it's a free service. So when you do get to the actual consultation period after an application is submitted, if you haven't spoken to them before, there's, oh, you could have talked to us before, Rug. And it's almost sweet that they're like, no, we're here. Can we get involved? Can we get involved? But then the actual experience of those discussions with the officer varies so much on the officer because the guidance is very principled and it's also quite broad in what it seeks to address.
Yeah, it's really hit or miss depending on who you get. Sometimes I'm sure they're fine, but I've been contacted by architects all over the country with kind of horror stories of meeting the designing out crime officer, the doco, and finding a sort of belligerent, cynical person who hates young people and hates socializing and thinks that any activity in public space is a risk and should be got rid of ideally. And that is a problem. You know, if you are going to have a system like this, then it needs to be consistent and it needs to be accountable. It needs to be held to a high standard. I've got no problem in theory with having a set of guidelines that think about security, but those should be publicly consulted on. And currently the Secured by Design guidelines aren't. They're just produced by the various police forces and then pushed through as if they're sacrosanct, which is very different to how thoroughly and carefully we develop the actual building regulations, for example. So potentially there's a way of reforming it that could be a lot better than current practice. But I think that the current way that Secured by Design is enacted is deeply flawed.
And at least to make it a bit more consistent, because as you say, some of the officers are going to be reasonable and they say, okay, just make sure that the doors or windows are past 24 rated, which is a security rating. And then you can also sometimes get officers that say you need the mailroom to be separate from the vestibule, but also it needs to have its own extracting fan because of anthrax. And you're like, wait, no.
What?
No.
Yeah, I live on a 1964 council estate that just couldn't be designed anymore. And it's a real shame because my estate is so successful from a community point of view. I know and I'm friends with more of my neighbours where I currently live than anywhere I have lived before. The reason that is possible is because of the architecture of the estate. It's because I can go to pretty much anyone's house and knock on their door quite easily. There aren't security gates everywhere. It's because it's highly pedestrianised. There's like 14 pedestrian routes into and through the estate, because many of the larger houses you can get in from the front or go through the back garden. So every single place feels quite open and welcoming. All of those principles the current Secured by Design program warns against. It advocates that you shouldn't have any of those things. You should have big gates on shared access blocks, that larger houses should only be accessible from one direction.
Fobs on everything.
Fobs on everything, minimal public space, fences, blah, blah, blah. And all of that stuff adds up to a sort of template formula for producing failed neighborhoods where people don't know each other, are suspicious of each other, hide inside behind curtains and fences, very securitized doors. And actually, that's a huge risk. If you're talking about genuine safety in a place, that comes from feeling safe and knowing that your neighbors are kind of looking out for you because they know who you are, they're invested in your health and well-being, and will come to your aid if needed. That's what makes a place genuinely safe, especially for children. So I'm actually concerned that in our attempt to design out crime, we are creating neighborhoods that feel actually quite unsafe.
The design out crime term especially is quite interesting. I have a colleague who says of the Secured by Design process and the docos, he says, look, their main job, their only job really, is to reduce the staffing and time burden on the Metropolitan Police by minimizing through design the number of 999 calls that they'll get.
Yeah.
Which is a much more sort of transactional, functional perspective than we're here to make it safe. Because good design is safe by its inclusivity. So that always just sort of struck me as a particularly
narrow-minded,
frank way to phrase what their involvement is meant to accomplish.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't strike a balance. And good design is all about striking a balance because you have many different competing priorities in any design challenge. And the best designers can navigate those competing priorities and create something that strikes a good balance. But if you give too much weight to one priority, let's say you want to provide enough car parking for residents. Great, that's a reasonable priority. But if you let that absolutely dominate your planning of a new neighborhood, you end up with a horrible car-centric scheme where there's loads of car parking, but there's no space for children to play and there's no space to meet your neighbors and so on. So you always have to strike a balance. And it's the same actually with fire engineering sometimes, that we don't always get the best fire engineers looking at new schemes. And so you can have a situation where someone who's fairly unqualified is advising various measures to reduce fire risk, but actually is blowing that way out of proportion and leading to a situation where you're not allowed a front garden or you can't have plants or something because they've decided that plants are a fire risk or some sort of completely nonsensical theory about how fires spread. But it's almost like it's coming from a good place, but because it is blown out of all proportion, because it's not in balance with other competing priorities, you end up with a negative outcome for the communities later down the line.
I'm smiling because Phineas said there's so many policies.
Yeah.
They have the best intention and they're written by a team who think, great, this is thorough, there's a hierarchy, we're being really clear about our expectations, or at least with discretion about where the actual sort of acceptability is within even the hierarchies. But digressing, when you add the sort of embodied carbon policy with the sustainability policy, with the Building Safety Act, with the cycle parking, with the you end up with a design that can be contrived rather than a good place or the best place for that site. And they're all such important issues. They're all such important issues. But I think decision makers and applicant teams need to then take on that sort of responsibility of not just doing the best possible for each one, but explaining why everything can be met 80%, but that's still good.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's easy to strike those balances, but I'm saying that is the value of a good design team, is that they set out consciously aware of the fact that they can't achieve every single priority 100% and that a good all-round design will achieve most things most of the time. Let's remember that it is actually quite easy to pick a lock. Like, you can learn how to pick a lock from a 5-minute YouTube tutorial. The reason we lock our houses is not to make them impossible to get into. It is to make sure that insurance companies pay out in the very unlikely scenario that someone actually breaks in. We're not trying to create perfectly
sterile places
that are impossible to get into. We're trying to strike a balance always. And that's why we have a Yale lock on our front door.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like your point about the terrorists, right? If someone is committed to breaking into your house, they will break into your house. The point is to have enough appropriate measures in place that your insurance company will cough up if that happens. And it probably won't happen because, as we know, most crime is falling very fast across all of society. That's not because of secure by design, that's because of much wider social trends. But I just feel like we're sometimes getting the balance all wrong, and that is feeding this loneliness crisis and this kind of isolation epidemic that is particularly prevalent in London, but more widespread as well.
The sort of idea of terrorist attacks is quite interesting because it reminds me of another example. We were the planning agents for a hotel near Heathrow.
Oh, yeah.
And the doco, I think, was maybe enjoying themselves too much, picturing sort of Die Hard style scenarios.
Right.
Where a plane is crashed into the hotel and you need this 6 or 8 inch thick glass on the frontages facing the runway, or again, anthrax attacks. And so it was sort of like, scenario, a plane has been diverted.
This is Die Hard 2.
It's I think through the course of those meetings, this officer probably wrote Die Hards 4, 5, and 6.
Right. Yeah, I've encountered a similar thing on my estate. We had to fight to keep the front gardens on some of the raised flats. And a very senior guy from the council came around and presented the most absurd scenario about what if you fall ill and your plants go unwatered for 6 months and they become dry and crispy, and then someone else walks past smoking a fag and they throw a fag into your burnt out, shriveled plant pot, that catches on fire, then that somehow burns the window down and the fire gets into your flat. Show this to any actually qualified fire engineer and it's total nonsense. They're like, well, this is not a serious risk. It's marginal at best. It's far better to have a few plant pots. But this is what can happen, is these people in positions of authority can come up with these nutty scenarios. And I think because we have quite an underfunded planning system.
Oh, absolutely.
Councillors and planning officers concede to these wacky scenarios rather than sticking up for moderate, balanced, good design principles. And these things end up getting built in rather negative ways. And I want to make the point that when we're thinking about police forces' influence over design, okay, some police forces are better than others. But in London, very recently we had the Casey review, which found that the Met, the London Metropolitan Police Service, was systemically misogynistic, racist and homophobic, and had thousands and thousands of officers under investigation for sexual harassment, was put into special measures by the government. There are so many reasons why this is an organisation that we probably don't want to get that involved with neighbourhood design. Yeah. There are other agencies available who think about security. You know, why do we have to turn to this organisation that, you know, there's a news story almost every single day about some failing somewhere in the Met, and yet we're continuously consulting them on really important matters of how you knit a community together. Yeah. That's crazy. So I think the whole system needs some political leadership to reform in some way.
We will be right back. I think the consultation ecosystem has ballooned, and it's good to get advice from experts, but you're also asking experts in their field, not experts in how their field relates to the built environment. And so they're not thinking about all the other things that a decision maker has to take into account, all these 45, 50 other considerations. They're thinking, scenario, a plane takes off. I think you're spot on with the workload upon the shoulders of officers. That creates this really unfortunate incentive where an officer doesn't have the time, maybe the political capital within the organization, to overrule consultees, and it gives basically everybody who doesn't have the big picture a veto power when that happens. And of course, a good officer is going to have the experience and the confidence to take all of the considerations in balance and still potentially take something to committee or approve under delegated powers despite existing objections. But I can understand as well, you know, that an officer who has twice as many cases as a private sector planning agent, might say, look, I've got all these other things to do. There's this objection. I'm not going to the mat for anything. You either resolve it or I'm just going to make that the reason for refusal.
Yeah.
So it's quite a confluence of sort of perverse incentives, I think.
I'm sympathetic to a point, I guess, with civil servants because, yes, they're under a lot of pressure. Yes, they should probably get paid more. Yes, they should work in an environment that is inspiring and ambitious rather than overburdened and unambitious. On the other hand, they are being paid by the taxpayer to provide a service to the public. And when they fall short, I think that is shameful. And so it is not okay ever for a planning officer to not hold themselves to a high standard. On the other hand, we absolutely should be supporting these guys. The cuts to planning offices over decades are horrendous, and we're all suffering as a result. But you wouldn't say it's okay for a police officer to harass a member of the public every now and then because they're under pressure and there's been lots of cuts. And I think the same, we have to hold these two things in our minds simultaneously, that planning officers are fundamentally important and do good work and need support, but also need to be held to a high standard and not be let off the hook when they do make rush decisions or kind of fail in their duties to strike an appropriate balance between multiple competing needs.
I completely agree. It's like when you come of age and you have to struggle with your family's traumas that you can that you can become a planner. No. That understanding does not equate to open acceptance of that failure, of that insufficiency. You mentioned car dependency briefly before, and it's something that we had chatted about earlier, a hesitancy or a resistance to change in the townscape, in the built environment, and especially, I would suggest, in the public realm. How do you see the future of car use in London?
Yeah, I was in Shanghai recently. Never been to China before, but went on a press trip to Shanghai. And this is a city of 20 million people, and it was quieter than the one-lane road next to my housing estate because so many of their vehicles are electric now. They have loads of electric mopeds as well and loads of bikes. And it then coming back to London and everything is kind of loud and smelly and polluted. And it was really shocking how far behind London is compared to other global cities. So when I'm thinking about the future of London, I think the car question has to be a huge part of that discussion. Actually, we've seen Zipcar saying it's going to close its UK operations, which have already declined to pretty much just London anyway. That is a huge blow. Yeah. More than half of our shared vehicles will go if Zipcar closes operations here. Why are they doing that? Because it's not quite profitable enough. Like they made a sort of few £1 million loss last year. At the same time, the government is pumping billions into private car ownership, subsidising Jaguar Land Rover, subsidising EV charging stations in order to prop up that section of the economy. Yeah. Why can we not see that incentivising shared car use probably is a better thing to do than incentivising more and more private car use? Yeah. There's loads of levers to pull in terms of transitioning London specifically, but British cities in general to more ecological transport modes. One of them absolutely has to be helping people to move away from needing to own and drive private cars to get around. I own a car, but I probably need to own a car. The only reason I need to have one is because I'm ineligible to join a hire car company because I've only been driving for 6 months, right? As soon as I become eligible to join a car club, I'm selling that car and joining a car club instead.
Whichever's left.
But will there be one left in a few months' time when I've passed my 1 year probation as a new driver? So this is extremely frustrating for me personally. I probably need to drive maybe 1% of the year, if that. Yeah. But if Zipcar goes away and if car clubs go away, I'll be stuck owning an extremely expensive lump of metal that I don't really need for almost all the time in order to very occasionally make a journey that I need a car for. That's incredibly inefficient. It's going to mean I'm taking up space in the city. It's going to cost me loads of money that I could be putting into a more useful part of the economy. So I think there's very good reasons why the government should be supporting shared cars as an alternative to private cars. But again, we don't seem to be getting that right at the moment.
I wonder if the Hertzes and the Enterprises of the world are going to be able to support their car sharing operation a little bit because they also have the Victoria Coach Station, Gatwick Airport kind of operations, which make a lot of sense and I'm sure are quite sensibly lucrative. So definitely a space to watch.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to fob off to Gatwick every time I need to get a car.
No, exactly. And Zipcar is owned by Avis, who are one of those big car hire companies. So I hope that this will precipitate like a new player in the scene. Maybe TfL could actually launch its own publicly owned car hire scheme, like they have the publicly owned TfL bikes. That would be a really interesting piece of political leadership. Somehow doubt it's going to happen, but like that could be a good outcome.
I could just imagine the byline. You're like, TfL cars, go slower.
But when TfL is a not-for-profit, publicly owned, fairly ambitious transport operator.
Got a lot of love for TfL.
Why not have a few, at least a trial, maybe in one borough. They buy and run 50 cars that anybody who has a TfL account can pay by the hour to use.
If they could do cargo vans with automatic transmissions, that would be quiche. Because I learned on a manual, but I learned and I had my first license at the US. So then by the time I lived in London for a few years and I ended up getting a license basically for like weekends in the Cotswolds or just the kind of simmering resentment that I wasn't licensed to drive here, even though I had for ages. I got a license, but then I also thought, I'm not fucking with the manual. Like, I'm just going to get the automatic transmission license.
Yeah.
And after all of my sort of AA trainings and whatever, and I passed the test, I walked away from that experience being like, nah, London, like, I don't want a piece of that. Because, it's not really a pleasant driving experience, but I think that I see a value in that.
Yeah.
Everything's negotiated. People are popping out from left, right, and center, not looking at the road. And you just think, like, every bus driver in London deserves an award. You know what I mean? It's crazy.
Yes, I think bus drivers got a lot better. Compared to when I moved to the city, I feel like they've really upped their game because it is really hard to drive in London. But you do sometimes need to do it. And so why then would we be incentivizing a system that promotes car ownership and therefore car driving rather than offers an alternative where you can do it when you need to, but you don't have to permanently opt into car having as a way of life. And from a sort of planning point of view, if we look at land use, our relationship with cars in the capital is even more sort of stark. So in Tower Hamlets, majority of households don't own a car at all, something like less than a third.
Shout out Tower Hamlets.
Shout out Tower Hamlets. However, more than twice as much land is being used for roads as housing. So you have an inner city borough with profound housing need, and we're using more than double as much land for roads as housing, even though most people who live there don't even have access to a car. Yeah. That seems mad to me. That, again, it feels like a sort of example of our priorities being out of whack.
I live in Tower Hamlets. You don't need a car, period. I think that there are complicated sort of intersections there, especially with the growing middle-class Bangladeshi community, and car ownership is an aspirational sort of achievement, and it's something that some families are really proud of. And I appreciate that. I think aspiration is commendable. But then that's where my like warmth about it stops. And I'm like, yeah, but this really isn't the right thing.
Yeah, aspirations are to some extent politically constructed. Of course, if you live in a borough where twice as much land is being used for roads than housing, then driving around is fairly easy because there's loads of roads everywhere. And so there's this thing called induced demand, where the more roads you build, the more people are likely to drive. And Tower Hamlets is a clear example of that, where if it had much better public transport perhaps, or much better pedestrianisation, maybe car ownership wouldn't be so aspirational, because the whole cityscape would be telling you a different story about what it is to have a good life, what it is to live in Tower Hamlets, what it is to be a sort of citizen of that part of London. So some sort of policymakers have a tendency to think that public opinion exists in a vacuum and their job is to respond to it. I think that policymakers also have a duty to set out what an aspirational way of life is, what kind of good means for our society. And that will be reflected to some extent in changing public attitudes.
It's leadership.
It's leadership.
And expertise. And it's rather than reactionary or strictly representative government, it's also a trustee role where you're taking the best information available and you're looking at a longitudinal sort of vision for a place. Lambeth did a curbside SPG. It's brilliant. And on the first or second page of it, it explains when we say curbside, we mean what you would normally call a car parking space on the street.
Okay.
But we're changing the terminology and we don't use it that way because we're working to end the presumption that is for the storage of private property on public land.
Right. Yes.
And that could be a suds garden. That could be a bike locker. That could be patio seating for a restaurant.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's really happened to that. Last time I've been in Lambeth, which is recently, it still looks like Lambeth did before. But I do want to give them a shout out anyway, because it's a really commendable document. It's brilliant. Yeah.
I found an incredible stat today about induced demand. This idea of like more car incentives means more driving in general. Norway was often looked at as like a real leader in sort of the future of cars in cities because they've made the EV transition really fast through enormous public subsidies. So something like 94% of new cars in Norway are electric. And you go to Oslo, you can just feel it in the air. It's quieter. However, there was a new study this year showing that actually more EV ownership is correlating with more driving. So households who've made that transition are actually driving more as a result, which is not ideal and perhaps not what was ever intended. Why are they doing that? Partly because it's cheaper. Got this cheap energy, electric, not having to buy some petrol. Also, your brand new shiny EV car is probably quite nice, actually. It's like probably slicker than your old petrol car.
Love a new car smell.
Also, you feel good. You know, you feel like you're saving the world driving around, even though those emissions are still coming from fossil fuels being burnt somewhere. You're still addicted to a behavior that is causing harm. You're still running people over in the street. You're still clogging up cities with congestion. You're still carving roads through neighborhoods. So I think it's a really important study because it shows that actually electric vehicles aren't a panacea at all, that they may be a marginal improvement on petrol cars, but the bigger picture has got to still be decreasing car use overall, increasing pedestrianisation and cycling, increasing public transport use. And I sometimes worry that the EV lobby is now so powerful that they have persuaded policymakers that we can just replace petrol cars with electric cars and that will solve everything, when it absolutely won't. It might even, as the Norway example shows, make things a bit worse.
So when we say make planning make sense, trademark, we start looking at all of these things that are factors in the built environment sector and in the built environment itself, outside of just the concept of the sector, but as lived experience, as quality of life indicators. And the laundry list of things that we'd be keen to improve just seems to get longer and longer. And there's probably really sensible and effective changes that we can make to just about every part of the industry. And we talked before about the sort of potential cultural resistance to change, that the status quo is comfortable, it's how we've always done it. Do you think that there's a cultural shift that would help bring about a new perspective on things that otherwise have been fought on very sort of case-by-case bases? So on-street car parking, investment in new public transport, pedestrianization, secure by design concepts, what open public space means for civil society. Privacy, drawing the heavy curtains rather than the sort of Dutch, I've got nothing to hide. Yeah, you can see me working late at night, I don't care. Which is also a de facto constraint on density and sometimes even neighborliness potentially, because you have that sort of intervisibility when people have their windows open. You have the eyes on the street. What would you love to see just sort of like catch in the hearts of the people who are currently quite resistant to change in their lives?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's very frustrating to come across people who resist what seems to be very positive improvement out of habit or a kind of reflexive negativity. On the other hand, I think the British are absolutely right to notice the incredibly poor quality of most of what is getting built at the moment. And I grew up in a 90s Taylor Wimpey estate that was bad and could have been much better. And I don't begrudge at all the kinds of communities who see a Taylor Wimpey estate or a similar volume house building estate landing outside their town and thinking, God, really? Like this looks bad. This looks poorly designed, strangled by cars, cut off from the town. I'm not convinced it's going to create a great neighborhood. Of course, I'm going to object to that through the planning process. It is difficult to go to the British and say, come on, why can't you be a bit more excited about change, when so many of them experience change as broadly negative? And this is also a country where we've had austerity now for, 16 years, 15 years and counting. So the only changes people experience are things like waiting times getting longer to see their hospital, getting harder and harder to find a nursery place, ambulances arriving hours after you called them. So maybe the thing that needs to change is not just like the culture of British people, but the quality of the change. If we were used to good things arriving on a regular basis, new services, cheaper services, then perhaps we'd be a bit more excited about change in general, because our experience of change would be like, oh yeah, change is good. I remember that thing that changed, that was good. Yeah. I remember that other thing that changed, that was good. If everything was as good as like the Elizabeth line, if that was like our main experience of new things, of course we'd be more excited about it. I
love where you went with that answer, and I think that you're completely correct. And this is maybe a little bit rosy, but shout out Tower Hamlets again, because we've had consultations for 30-story towers in Tower Hamlets, and we put out all of the tea and the biscuits and the M&S sandwiches, whatever, and then just no one comes all day. And it's right next to a busy community hall and a school, and people are passing by left and right and center, and no one is thinking, my civic participation today is going to be to scold people about the scarcity that I feel. But Tower Hamlets is also a borough that has improved the quality of life and the outcomes for its residents so significantly, in large part to draw a distinction between it and other similar examples through development. And I like that Tower Hamlets has been open for business, but that has a self-reinforcing kind of quality to it. They should also pedestrianize more of their roads, by the way.
Yeah, it should be a really exciting part of our democracy, right? Yeah. That most things that happen, we don't get much direct say on, except the planning system, where for some reason we can have quite a direct involvement in all sorts of weird things, perhaps too much in some places. Do I really need to have a say about whether my neighbour is putting a dormer window into their loft conversion or whatever?
Totally out of character.
Perhaps that's a bit too far in my opinion. But it is amazing that we have built a democracy with that level of civic opportunity for participation. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to lead to a really lively, dynamic culture of participatory thinking and planning and decision making. Yeah. It just seems to lead to sort of belligerent adversarialism and communities feeling like they're often involved in quite cynical, fake consultation processes where all the key players have made all the key decisions well in advance and they're just ticking a box, and that's the only engagement that you're actually being meaningfully offered, which breeds resentment and mistrust rather than breeding a kind of lively, enthusiastic civic process. And I think there's other better examples across Europe. Switzerland clearly has a much more thoughtful urban design culture within the population at large, and people engage in micro-referenda on planning applications in a way that would be unthinkable here.
Sounds terrifying here.
But they do it, and they do it well, and they have some of the best new architecture in the world.
It's fascinating to think of the ways that opportunities for engagement are reductive then for how those citizens, neighbors do engage. And so if somebody thinks that their only space for engagement is the strongly worded letter, then that is a process failure, and the solution needs to be open and inviting engagement earlier. And we've talked before on the podcast with public affairs and neighborhood engagement specialists, and they cannot say often enough that the actual plan making process needs to be more inclusive and that the outreach needs to be stronger. Because if people feel that they've helped set the rules where everything is stitched up, so many times I'm in a consultation and people are like, I hate this about it. And I say, that's what the London plan requires. So sorry, that's just actually not in our power to change.
Yeah.
And if they felt that they had participation in the rules, then it would be a very different dynamic. I'd love to see figures on it, to be honest, but I am fairly certain that the number of people in any authority who object on individual applications is going to be much greater than the number of people who participated in that local plan process.
Yeah, could totally, because of course, like getting involved in the London plan part revision process is like just much more interesting and much more technically demanding than getting involved in whether or not someone should dump a 5G tower on the corner of your street.
Yeah.
Because one seems abstract and far off and technical, and one seems immediate and local and comprehensible or relatable.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was the case.
And I completely understand it's far more technical. It's so much more time consuming. Let me get my head around this 450-page document and then see what the next 480-page document is going to look like versus, oh, I got this letter. Let me see. No, I hate it. Object.
Yeah.
And how we break that time barrier. Because one of the things we were joking about on that episode was that, like, people are just busy, y'all. Like, everyone's got enough on. And I write in letters of support for development in my area, but not every single time, because sometimes I just think I'm not adding something to my plate today.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to fix that particular problem, because even really robust public affairs strategies, especially for things as sort of esoteric as like a local plan drafting process, are still going to have low engagement relative to the number of people they're reaching with an invitation to participate.
Yeah, well, where are the incentives is the answer to the question of how do you get more people to participate. If I think of my neighbourhood again, every now and then a telecoms company comes along and wants to dump a 5G tower on the estate because it's council-owned land, and so they see it as a softer target than dumping it on a privately owned street nearby. And every time the community fights back because they're like, why would we surrender a chunk of our public realm? So it's like you're asking us to give up a bit of our estate for nothing in return. There's no suggestion that, and if you do this, you'll get some cool new cycle hangers or something. So of course residents have no reason to write in and support this private telecoms company's request to dump a load of equipment on what feels like our land, because there's no incentive to. And it's the same with housing, because if someone's saying, okay, I want to build a whole load of homes, unless those homes are socially rented, most people know that the kid down the road is not going to be able to afford to live there. The young people that you see hanging around in need of support, in need of places to live and things to do, are never going to be able to afford these new homes that are being proposed. And so, of course, your instinct is to oppose those things because they don't feel like they're for the community. They feel like they're for someone else, someone much richer, someone from outside the community who doesn't necessarily share the sort of the values and the lived experience of that community. If, however, we had much more social housing being built, then I think people would have a very different relationship to new planning applications, because there'd be more of a sense of, new housing, that means that maybe I could live there one day. These things are going to be affordable. They'll be pegged to local incomes. These are for us. They're for like the community. And
these poor councils would have millions and millions of pounds a month off of their expenses because they don't have to be paying for this extremely costly temporary accommodation.
Yeah.
Where does the money come from? From better consultation? Like stemming the bleeding in these like failures, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that sounds glib, I know, but it is a little bit, so we can't get into like all like the 8 different sort of specific things that would have to change to fix what we're describing as one problem. But on the consultation point, I'm just going to pitch an idea. It's just coming to me fresh.
Okay.
Yeah. GLA, if you're listening. For me, one of the challenges in really fully participating is that time and that chunk of time that you need to reasonably set aside. So even on a single application, you can only download 25 documents at a time. And you also kind of want to make your comments substantive other than just like 2 thumbs up from me. On a local plan consultation process, though, you've got a longer time frame and you've got more issues than that, like a Duolingo style app, the London Plan consultation app. So while you're having your morning coffee or when you're on the escalator coming out of the train station, just be like, yeah, I'll answer a couple questions. What do you think about this? And it could be broad principle. It could be like more specific metrics.
Yeah.
If I could contribute just in these little moments that I actually have, I'd love that. And also it would probably be a fair way to actually drive engagement from, but at least reach younger voters, younger members of society.
Yeah. I was listening to a very good interview with Roger Hallam, the climate activist recently, who's a huge advocate of sortition, the same process that you'd use to assemble a jury, where you pick people at random. And it reminded me of something Finn Williams, he's now the city architect of Malmo, was saying ages ago, which is why don't we use sortition more in the planning process for consultations? You don't need people to self-select. You could actually choose them through, you have been selected to take a view on the London plan. We're going to pay you for your time to
I actually love that idea.
read through this document properly.
Yeah.
So you don't just go to the public at large. You select some random people from the public and then you empower them to be your consultative body. And that still gives you the same thing of like a public voice, but it's a manageable number of people who you can remunerate, build it into sort of what it means to be a citizen is like every now and then you'll be called on to take a view on a planning question. Also, potentially you could use it so it's not always the most local people. So I might be asked to take a view on something in my neighborhood, but like a few blocks over, and that might give slightly more rational removed distance from the emotional feeling you're going to get when you see this thing.
I don't want construction dust and That's fascinating. And actually, Finn Williams came up in the conversation we had with Peter Murray on the podcast because we were talking about, I think just sort of design and design-led vision. And I mentioned Västra Hamnen in Malmö. And then, of course, Peter Murray being Peter Murray, he was like, actually, Finn Williams used to be at this place and now they're actually, as you say.
I don't know if he's ever put his sortition plan into action, but I thought that's a good idea because actually one of the big problems with the planning process in Britain is it's just so dominated by people who can write a letter and have the time to write a letter, who are often older or wealthier. And so young people are like almost entirely designed out of the process by the sort of formats and formulas that it uses to consult people. The fact that planning announcements are still cable tied to lampposts without any pictures or more engaging announcements is mad. If we're genuinely trying to engage people about something, why are we not giving them material in a more dynamic way? Why are we not using social media more? Why are we not using TikTok to promote the fact that there's a planning application in your area? Would you like to take a view on it? It's totally possible to target an audience based on where they live using digital tools, but I very rarely see that being used. I have seen it a couple of times being used, but like barely. And so I think there's just so many reforms that could be made to how we engage people that we should be continuously testing. Britain has an aversion to testing things on real life scenarios. Like people don't want to be treated as guinea pigs or something, but we're a big country. We have lots of different local authorities. We could be trialing things all over the place and seeing what works and then building national guidance around those trials.
If I'm ever selected for London Plan jury duty, I am going to be over the moon. This has been great. Phineas Harper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.